Ukraine will do well to survive a harsh winter. That's the narrative being followed by many media outlets and think tanks, especially as Russia intensifies its long-range assaults against Ukraine's energy infrastructure and civilians. Russia is trying to freeze Ukraine's people into surrender, but something is being missed in all of these tales of Russia's winter strategy. Yes, Ukraine has to endure another tough winter, but Russia may not even survive the cold snap. That's not because Ukraine is on the verge of destroying the Russian army. Russia won't survive the winter because Vladimir Putin's war economy is exploding, and the cold months of 2025 and 2026 are going to deliver a reckoning that he never saw coming. Why? Well, for a start, Russia is no longer teetering on the edge of a recession. According to Ukraine's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, the Russian economy has now entered a recession, and there seems to be no light at the end of the tunnel. Taking to X on December 17th, Sybiha laid bare the terrible economic situation that Russia now faces. The Russian budget is in the red, and it's time to ramp up sanctions pressure. There is now a real possibility of making the cost of continuing the war unbearable for the Kremlin, Sybiha declared. Data show that despite the Russian government's efforts to soften the impact of sanctions, Russia's economy begins to face some dramatic issues while it enters recession. Sybiha then reeled off a laundry list of figures, all of which prove the point that he's making. Censor.net reported on some of these figures, noting that the period between January 2025 and November 2025 has seen the Russian federal budget deficit rise to a record-breaking $54 billion, and it's not done climbing yet. By the end of the year, the deficit may reach $70 billion, and Russia simply isn't generating enough revenue to start clawing some of the money back. As the country moves into 2026, that massive deficit is likely to grow even larger, meaning that Putin is sending his country hurtling into a debt situation from which it may need years to recover. The deficit situation is also affecting Russia on the regional level. In 2024, Russia's various regions were basking in a collective surplus of $12 billion. Now that situation has been completely reversed, to the point that these regions face a consolidated deficit of $1.5 billion, Sybiha says. If Putin thinks that these are just temporary issues that Russia's taxation of oil revenue can solve, then he must think again, Sybiha adds. Russia's energy revenue is decreasing. Its oil and gas profits fell 34% in November 2025 versus November 2024. This alone has cut $3.5 billion from Russia's budget, Ukraine's foreign minister reports. Debt is up, revenue is down. And Putin is still pushing forward with a war that Ukraine's main intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, claims is costing Russia as much as $1 billion per day. Anybody could tell you that this was a recipe for financial disaster, though Putin seems to have been ignorant of the economic chasm into which he was leading his country. Willfully ignorant, as it turns out, because there were plenty of people inside Russia who were warning Putin about where his policymaking was taking the economy months before Sybiha revealed that rock bottom just smashed Russia in the face. Back in June, the Russian Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, spoke at the annual St. Petersburg Economic Conference. He delivered a stark warning during his speech, remarking, "The numbers show the Russian economy is cooling off. Judging by business sentiment at the moment, Russia is basically already on the brink of falling into a recession." The Bank of Russia seemed to agree with the sentiment, noting that Russia's gross domestic product was shrinking in 2025. Putin didn't listen. Instead, Russia's leader bullishly insisted that the economic experts whom he put in place to advise him about running the country's finances must be wrong. In September, just a few months after Reshetnikov made his comments, Putin had entered full-on denial mode. Literally, it turned out, as a Reuters report from that month says that Putin claimed that Russia's economy wasn't stagnating, despite a central bank report saying the exact opposite. Interest rates of 18% were perfectly normal and were required to battle high inflation, Reuters reports Putin is claiming at the time. Russia's leader appeared to fail to realize that high borrowing costs combined with a rising cost of living are far from the signs of a healthy economy. If inflation overwhelms the economy, nothing good will come of it, because it becomes impossible to forecast anything even for 10 days, let alone for years ahead, Putin said in September. He is right, but it's clear that a sky-high interest rate isn't fixing the problem for Russia, which means that Putin is ignoring the very real issues behind the scenes that have catapulted his country into the economic doldrums. Still, Putin has a solution. He ordered the recession not to happen. During the same month that Reshetnikov warned of the impending Russian recession, Politico reported that Putin had ordered him and anybody who thinks like him to simply not allow the recession to happen. Some specialists and experts are pointing to the risks of stagnation or even recession. This, of course, is not to be allowed under any circumstances, Putin declared. It's also simple. Reshetnikov must have been kicking himself that he hadn't thought of the genius idea of simply not allowing the recession to happen. Of course, reality waits for no broken economic system, and Russia now finds itself in the very recession that Putin claimed and ordered wouldn't happen. Putin is well aware of that reality, even if he pretends that it isn't biting him on the backside as we speak. Sabia points out that the Kremlin's approach to tackling the economic problems caused by Putin's narrow-minded focus on the war is to place more pressure on everyday Russians who already languish under the skyrocketing cost of living and high interest rates we've already mentioned. Moscow is forced to raise taxes, including a highly sensitive VAT increase, and cut SME subsidies, resulting in further recession and the shadowing of its endemically corrupt economy. While the Russian population is getting poorer and more vulnerable, Putin's cronies keep profiteering from the war, Sabia declared on X. Sabia also delivered a brutal assessment of what Putin has done to the Russian economy that he once claimed so much credit for fixing. By refusing to end his brutal and senseless aggression against Ukraine, Putin is plunging Russia, once a thriving economy with rising living standards, into a deep recession, worse than the one it experienced in the 1990s, Sabia revealed. Ukraine's foreign minister is certainly right about Putin stinging his people with higher taxes. As the budget deficit grows and oil revenues fall off a cliff, Putin has ordered that everyday Russians hand over bigger slices of the pay packets that buy them less with each passing month to the state. In September, Russia's finance ministry announced that it will be raising the country's value-added tax, or VAT, rate from 20% to 22%. Though seemingly a modest increase, VAT is essentially a sales tax that applies to practically everything that the Russian people buy. It's also a big money earner for the Kremlin, as it was responsible for 15% of the Russian government's revenue in 2024. Putin will hope that the percentage climbs higher as he forces his people to live in a country where they have less money to spend and have to pay exorbitant interest rates to borrow. The VAT increase also wasn't the first time that Russia stung its own people with a tax increase in 2025. At the start of the year, Putin broke a promise that there will be no big changes to Russia's tax system until 2030 by sharply increasing personal income taxes. And Russia's small businesses are unlikely to escape the Kremlin's desperate money grabbing. As Politico reports, the finance ministry is not just raising taxes, it's proposing to bring far more small and medium-sized businesses into the tax net, reducing the annual revenue threshold for reporting to 10 million rubles, $120,000, from the current 60 million, or about $745,000. It's also introducing a 5% tax on gambling and a 25% income tax on bookmakers, the outlet said in September. At least the ministry was transparent about the reasons why Putin was breaking his tax promises. The measures are aimed at primarily financing defense and security, the ministry revealed in a statement. Any hope that Russia's people might have had that Putin would reverse course was dashed a few months after these announcements. In November, the Russian State Duma passed the tax increases bill that makes these new measures law, in addition to approving Russia's 2026 to 28 budget. Russia will spend $209.5 billion on its military in 2026 under this budget, so it looks like no end is in sight for the Russian people's collective economic woes unless something convinces Putin that it's time to end the war. The financial crippling of his own country hasn't been enough to do it. Yet. To Sabia, this news of Russia's woes is a signal that more needs to be done to place pressure on Putin to end the war. Peace negotiations aren't doing the trick, as Russia's leader is convinced that he has enough leverage on the Ukrainian battlefield to make demands that Ukraine will never accept. Instead, Ukraine and its partners should be hitting Russia so hard with more sanctions that it won't just be the country's regular people who feel the sting. Putin and the money men and money women of Russia also need to experience the financial pain that the war against Ukraine has created. The transatlantic community's sanctions policy, implemented since 2022, has been and remains strategically sound and effective. Sanctions are working. They are depriving the Russian war machine of resources to murder and destroy, Sabia declared on X, before stating that more of this kind of work needs to be done. Pressure must continue to build. There is a real chance that the economic pressure will become unbearable for Putin. He does not count the thousands of soldiers he kills every day to gain additional square meters of Ukrainian territory. However, he keeps track of the money that belongs to him personally and his cronies. There has been a debate over the effectiveness of Western sanctions against Russia. In February, The Conversation even published a piece in which it claimed that sanctions rarely achieve their goals and that they appear to have failed in Russia. The outlet notes that sanctions have caused some economic disruption in Russia, though it perhaps underestimates how much, given that the article was published before Russian ministers started decrying the country's collapse into recession. Inflation, labor shortages, and currency devaluation have all been problems for Russia, but they appear to have a limited overall impact. The outlet cites an April 2024 prediction by the International Monetary Fund, which said that Russia's economy would grow faster than all of the other advanced economies in the world in 2024. That prediction has aged like milk. But even now that we know just how badly the Russian economy has collapsed, there is still an argument to be made that the West could and should be doing more with its sanctions. Sabia points that out himself, noting that the US, European Union or EU, and the Group of 7 nations still have an enormous amount of leverage at their disposal that they could use to place even more pressure on Russia. Right now, Sabia claims, only 20% of Russia's military-industrial complex is being sanctioned. Another 80% leaves a lot of wiggle room for new financial restrictions. Perhaps it's time that the West use that leverage to show Putin that he isn't in as strong a negotiating position as he believes himself to be. Simon Johnson, who is an economist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Sloan School of Management, seems to agree with Sabia. He says that the sanctions that the US and other countries have implemented work, but they could work much better. The keys lie in cooperation between the sanctioning entities and the willingness of those entities to experience a little pain themselves to ensure the squeeze is truly placed onto Putin. For enforcement to be entirely credible and effective, the West has to be willing to incur at least some potential costs, although clever policy design can reduce those costs, Johnson says. The EU in particular hasn't always been willing to absorb its share of the pain. However, that's going to change due to action that the EU is taking, which looks set to hurt Russia even more. Stick with us as we'll explore the EU's new measure a little later in the video. Despite these occasionally pessimistic outlooks on the sanctions that the West has applied to Russia, there is no denying that what is in place is still working, even if it could be working better. United 24 Media makes that point in a December 17th article, where it says that the state of Russia's industry shows that sanctions are already working better than some give them credit for. Building on the numbers that Sabia shared about the same industry, United 24 Media revealed that Russia's oil and gas revenues account for about 40% of the country's federal budget, which is the cash pot from which Putin hasn't removed his grubby hand ever since he launched his invasion. The so-called war chest has been repeatedly hit by sanctions, price declines, falls in Russian oil shipments, and throughout 2024 and 25, Ukraine's repeated strikes against Russian oil infrastructure. Now, the outlet says Russia's oil and gas revenues are plummeting to levels not seen since the COVID-19 pandemic. December 2025 is on course to encapsulate the oil woes inflicted on Russia by sanctions and other measures, as Russia will only pick up around half the amount of money from oil and gas revenues that it generated in December 2024. Oil exports are still putting in about $5 billion per month for Russia, but the numbers keep on dropping to the point where Russia is going to end up with $40 billion less than the $130 billion its Ministry of Finance anticipated the oil and gas industry's earning for 2025. Don't underestimate the impact that this loss of $40 billion will have on Russia, given the recession the country has entered and the many economic issues with which Putin is failing to grapple or simply outright ignoring. Russia is trying to maintain a strong ruble to create the illusion of economic wealth. But the price of Ural's crude dropping by 28% over the last 3 months, now hitting about $40 per barrel, reveals that sanctions are playing a solid part in hurting Russia. Russia's shadow fleet, which is the shady collection of aging oil tankers that Putin has used to bypass sanctions in the past, is also on its knees. Russia is loading more oil onto these ships, with the volume of oil loaded having risen by 28% since August. However, sanctions both on Russia and individual ships in the shadow fleet are making it harder for Russia to find buyers for this oil. Around 180 million barrels of Russian crude are still at sea rather than arriving safely in a buyer's port as of December 17th. That's an increase of 40% since the end of August, which tells us that Russia still has the oil to sell, but the buyers aren't queuing up as readily as before. The UK's National Crime Agency points out that about 400 Shadow Fleet ships have been sanctioned by the UK, US, EU and Canada. That's playing a role in Russia's Shadow Fleet woes, as a sanctioned ship is harder to insure and less likely to be accepted into port. Lloyd's List adds that the EU has also sanctioned a number of companies that it believes facilitate Putin's use of the Shadow Fleet, which further tightens the noose on the workaround that Putin has used to evade sanctions in the past. It's all starting to add up, and we're seeing the impact of sanctions like these on Russia's oil and gas revenues. Still, more can be done, as Sabia points out. And that brings us back to something we touched upon earlier. For all of its donations of military aid to Ukraine, the EU's attempts to sanction Russia have long been held back by the fact that the bloc still purchases an enormous amount of oil and liquid natural gas, or LNG, from Putin's oligarchical cronies. High North News reports that EU purchases of LNG actually rose during the first half of 2025, when compared to the same period in 2024. EU nations purchased 5% more Russian LNG during that period, with the higher price of LNG meaning that 5% increase in volume resulted in a 30% rise in revenue for Russia. Pipeline gas payments declined at least. Still, the first 6 months saw the EU pump €8.4 billion, or about $9.85 billion, into the Russian economy. EU Observer adds that 4 EU states, namely Spain, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, have spent more on Russian LNG between 2022 and June 2025 than they've delivered in aid to Ukraine. The aid figure sits at €21.2 billion, or almost $24.9 billion, while LNG purchases by those 4 nations for the period amount to €34.3 billion, or about $40.27 billion. Those EU states, along with many others, have been trying to avoid the pain that they have to absorb to make their sanctions really count against Russia. But that's about to change. Following the passing of a new regulation on December 17th by the European Parliament, the EU is banning spot market Russian LNG from early 2026. The same legislation says that EU nations will phase out their purchases of Russian pipeline gas by September 30th, 2027. The legislation was passed by a vote of 500 for, 120 against, and 32 abstentions. All that's left is the formalization of the bans via an endorsement by the European Council, which is practically guaranteed to happen. The EU is also looking to tackle its own reliance on Russian oil. As part of the legislation that it passed on December 17th, the European Commission has committed to presenting more legislation that will ban purchases of Russian oil and oil products. That legislation has to be pushed across the EU desk by early 2026, and it must stipulate that whatever bans that are proposed come into effect no later than the end of 2027. Finally, it seems that the EU has woken up to its double standard. It may be that this banning of Russian LNG imports, combined with the later banning of oil imports, ends up being the final nail in the coffin of Putin's Ukraine war ambitions. Russia's war chest isn't unlimited. It's already been drained to the point where the country has entered a recession. It faces massive debt, and it's not generating enough revenue to claw its way back. Winter is already going to be devastating to Russia, but the bleakness of the months to come will only grow worse as more pressure is piled onto a Russian economy that has already hit its breaking point. And it could all get much worse for Russia if the EU's new plan for using the country's frozen assets comes into fruition. A loan has been proposed that will solve Ukraine's financial woes as Russia is deeply mired in its own. Find out about that massive new plan and what it could mean for the war in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more updates on the crumbling Russian economy. And thank you, as always, for watching.